Why does the ERA conduct independent inquiries?
The Treasurer of Western Australia is able to ask the ERA to investigate any issues of importance or interest to the Western Australian people. So, for example, in recent years, we've done an inquiry on shared services, we've done an inquiry on microeconomic reform, we've also done a number of other inquiries, including our most recent one, which is an inquiry into the Western Australian prison system.
Briefly, tell us about the prison inquiry.
The Treasurer asked us to look at the performance of the Western Australian prison system. So look at initiatives that could be introduced to improve incentives for the prison system, to improve the monitoring of our prisons, and to ensure that we end up with a better outcome for Western Australian taxpayers, both in terms of the money that they spend and in terms of their security and the safety of the Western Australian community. We came up with 44 recommendations, including a range of benchmarks that should be applied to the prison system to help reach those objectives.
So, what are the problems with our prison system?
There's a number of problems that have underpinned this inquiry. The prison system in Western Australia is expensive. Think of it this way. When we put a person in prison for a year, we're protecting the Western Australian community, but it costs over $100,000 a year on average to have that prisoner imprisoned for the year. So think of it as a choice for the Western Australian community. You can have a science teacher in your school or another person in prison. You can have more nurses in your hospital or more people in prison. And so the inquiry was motivated to make sure we're getting the best value for money for the Western Australian taxpayer. And our inquiry showed that that's not the case at the moment. There's a lack of accountability, there's a lack of transparency, particularly in our public prisons. Our public prisons are not operating in the way that best rehabilitates prisoners. The best way of keeping society safe is to make sure that people, when they get out of prison, don't re-offend and have to be put back in prison. That's just costly for everybody. It's costly for the police, it's costly for the community, and it doesn't serve our interests. So our inquiry recommendations are addressing a way to design better incentives, better transparency, better rehabilitation outcomes for our prisons.
Western Australia has both public and private prisons. What are their differences?
There's a range of differences across the public and private prison system. One that gets brought up quite often is people say, well, is it cheaper to run the prisons as private prisons? And that's not a conclusion we reached, because you can't reach that conclusion. There's a whole bunch of factors that go into the costs of a prison and costs of individual prisons. For example, a prison that takes women prisoners only is going to be more expensive than a prison that takes male prisoners only. That's because, for example, Bandy Up, our main women's prison, needs to have maternity facilities. Men don't get pregnant. You don't need those facilities at a men's prison. Similarly, if you have a prison that has high security prisoners, that's going to be more expensive than a prison that is, say, a work farm, low security prisoners that are moving back into the workforce. So it's sometimes stated that private prisons are cheaper or less costly than public prisons. That's just naive. That's not something that we come up with, and that's not the case in Western Australia. You have to look at all the costs, you have to look at the prison mix, and that's one of the things we're very careful to do, particularly when looking at comparisons across prisons, looking at benchmarks, making sure that we adjust for prisoner population so that we're comparing apples with apples, not making naive apple and orange comparisons.
So why do Western Australian prisons cost more than the national average?
There's, again, a range of reasons that feed into this. Some are sort of clear from just the geography of Western Australia. If you've got the West Kimberley Correction Centre, it's a long way from Perth. It's a long way from pretty much anywhere, and it is an expensive facility to run. If you look at our urban prisons, we're not out of line with the national average. But in some ways, cost isn't the key thing. What we're interested in is outcomes. if we can get better outcomes, that will automatically drive down the costs. So yes, we're more expensive on average than other Australian states, but other Australian states more compact. Again, you're not comparing apples with apples, you're doing apple and orange comparisons.
Are you advocating the privatisation of the WA prison system?
No, that's easy. If you look at our recommendations, you'll find that we talk about ownership and about what we call commissioning right down at the back of the report. And when people ask me about that, a lot of parties said, oh, if this inquiry is just about privatising prisons. We very quickly worked out that privatisation and ownership is quite frankly a second order issue compared to the gains that we can make within the public prison system that is the vast majority of our prisons in Western Australia today. How do we do that? Well, one of the ways we do that is by improving accountability. So we want to have a system where our prison superintendents can run and operate their prisons. That may sort of sound obvious, but that's not the situation that exists in Western Australia at the moment. We have a situation where the key manager, the superintendent of a prison, actually controls as little as 15% of their budget. There's a lot of overlap between central authority and the prison superintendent and the prison officers on the ground. And we need to make those lines of authority much clearer. A way to do that is to have service level agreements between the Department of Corrections and the individual prisons, the people who are operating the prisons on the ground. Delegate to them the authority and let them do their jobs of running the prisons, because that's what they're good at. So that's one of our key recommendations. Interestingly, that does relate to the private versus public prison mix, because we have very transparent contracts with private prisons. So every year you will see public reports on our 2 private prisons in Western Australia. You don't get that on our public prisons. Why not? If it's good enough for the private prisons, why don't we have the same transparency, the same accountability for our public prisons? So that's one of our key areas of recommendation. Another piece of fruit lying around waiting to be picked up and eaten is relating to information. We have lots of information on our prison population, but we don't use it properly. And we don't feed that into rehabilitation outcomes for prisoners. For example, prisoners don't just sit around in their cells all day. That would be a bit of a disaster, and it certainly wouldn't lead to more rehabilitation, it may lead to more riots. What we have for our prisoners is programs. So if a prisoner comes in who is drug dependent, that prisoner needs to go on a drug rehabilitation program, and they need to complete that, preferably before they're released back into the community. If that program's successful, we'll have somebody who gets released, gets a job, doesn't reoffend. But if they don't have access to that program, then they're likely to reoffend, because we're just going to be putting a person who's addicted to narcotics back out on the streets again. And similarly with other programs, people who come into prison but they've come from backgrounds where they haven't received training that enables them to have a job. We've got programs in prisons at the moment that should offer that training, but we're not matching prisoners cleverly with the programs. It's often done on a first come, first served basis. So the prisoners that can get the most benefit aren't necessarily the ones doing the programs. We looked at that and just said, this is nonsensical. We've got the information. Use the information to better gear the programs to the prisoners. That will lead to a better outcome and a safer community for Western Australia. So there's some of a flavour of the recommendations, the sorts of recommendations that we've got. We've come up with a series of benchmarks so that we can transparently evaluate our prisons. Quite frankly, there will be a league table saying, what are the well-performing prisons? What are the prisons that are performing subpar? And that's important information for the Western Australian public, because it's their dollars that are paying for these prisons. And yes, at the end of our report, we talk about different ways of providing services, because some prison services can best be provided by private operators, some can best be provided by not-for-profit, and some are best provided by the public sector. And often it will be a mix of those services. So for example, we've got a private prison in Acacia that's working very closely with a not-for-profit, Mission Australia, to help reintegrate prisoners post-release back into society. Why don't we have that same sort of integration in our public sector for our public prisons? So we do talk about making sure that the best parties are able to provide the relevant services for individual prisons and for our prison system. And that's what we mean by commissioning. But it's certainly not privatisation.
Finally, Stephen, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think there's two statistics I would like people to walk away with, because they show some of the issues we need to deal with in the Western Australian prison system. First statistic, Western Australia has the most overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our prison system. So 40% of our prisoners are Indigenous Australians. Why? What's going wrong there? Secondly, 1/3 of people who were sentenced to prison in 2013 were in prison for 8 days or less. That's really expensive, because whilst on average it's $100,000 a year to keep someone in prison, the first few weeks of prison are the most expensive time. So if we have a system that's biased towards putting people for very minor offences into prison for periods of 8 days or less, that's a really high cost to the Western Australian taxpayer. So I think whilst we've looked at the prison system, whilst we've come up with a range of suggestions, a range of recommendations to improve the prison system, there are some underlying issues that the Western Australian Government and the people of Western Australia have to think about. Indigenous overrepresentation, and are we actually dealing with minor offences in an appropriate way, or can we deal with that in a way that protects society but doesn't cost us so much money? And if we can face up to those two challenges going forward, I think that'll be great for Western Australia.